So, as I was saying, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and attending. This is the LMSW Scope of Practice Chapter Chat. We are so grateful for several people who have joined us for this chapter chat. And Dan Pepitone, who has done a lot of work with our chapter over, I'd say, like last year. He's been a great resource for us, for many social workers, both members and non-members. We had a chapter chat last week on building a private practice, which was amazing. I think I see a few of your names and faces here with us again. So thank you for joining us. We also have two wonderful members, Sandy Cheekin and Marcia Levy, here with us, two of our resident experts in the world of LCSW and private practice and all those things. They're two folks that we often call on, and they do also so much work as members in the background. As both the chapter doesn't have clinicians on staff, so they're really there, as eyes and ears and voices of clinicians. So I'm really grateful for all the work that they've done to prepare for this chapter chat. And thank you so much. So you don't need to hear from me anymore. I'm going to pass it on to Dan Pepitone. And thank you so much again, Dan, for joining us for this chat tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, Amelia, and Sam, and everyone else who has helped prepare for this, in particular, Olivia Knox, who has put together a really helpful FAQ on these issues. So I really encourage people to take a look at that and become familiar with the information that Olivia has worked so hard to put together. Olivia, I don't know if you have any thoughts, not to put you on the spot.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dan. So I just want to note, while NASW, New York State, is not the regulating body of licensure for the state, our mission does include strengthening the profession. In order to strengthen the profession, it is essential that all social workers understand and work within their legal scope of practice. So as a response to many questions frequently asked by our members, we created the FAQ document, hoping to address the concerns, and that serves as a guide for information on the social work scope of practice in New York State, clinical services offered by social workers, and information on the New York State education law and regulations of the commissioner as they apply to New York State social workers. So I put that link to the Dropbox in the chat, and we will be putting the link to the website in the chat throughout the session as well.
Thanks so much. I think you just carved down about 5 minutes about what I was going to say in a much nicer and more concise manner. Appreciate that. So yeah, I think Sandy, Marcia, Sam, and Olivia are going to jump in at various times too if they feel ready for it. But I'm going to kind of dig in, and I want to just remind people too that the information that we're providing here is not legal advice. It's not intended to be relied upon as legal advice. A lot of what we're talking about here are regulations that are quite broad, and it can be difficult for us to, lock down specifics with the Office of Professions or others. So I really do encourage people, if you have specific situations, you really should talk to someone. You should speak to an attorney and consider your situation independently of, other people's situations. But with that, it is really helpful to have this opportunity for us to chat about the issues and learn about other people's experiences, questions they have, and maybe how they interpret the regulations as well. So please feel free to get involved here too. So yeah, Olivia already alluded to it too, some of the places where we can find the regulations. For the most part, we're really looking at the New York State education law. We are also considering the rules of the Board of Regents, and other places where standards or recommendations have been made, including with some of the guidance that's been provided by the NASW, which I certainly encourage people to check out as well. So getting started, the New York Education Law, Article 154, covers the profession and practice of social work. The education law permits LMSWs to engage in a range of activities to assist clients and limits them from engaging in activities requiring other licensures, specifically LCSW licensure. So section 77011 covers LMSWs, and section 77012 covers LCSWs. Did I say that right? It sounds wrong in my head. Okay, 77011 is for LMSWs and 77012 covers LCSWs. LMSWs can also perform social work functions that do not require a license, and that is laid out further in section 7702. That's activities that do not require a license. LMSWs are not clinicians. This is probably the biggest takeaway phrase of the session today. The Office of Professions has sort of spoken to this and drawn it out a little bit more for us. And they say in your private practice, as an LMSW, you can only provide non-clinical services such as self-help, supportive counseling, intake, case management, and community social work, among other things. And those services are not countable towards LCSW experience hours. You're not able to do diagnosis, psychotherapy, or clinical work, and you cannot hire a supervisor. We're gonna break some of that stuff down a little bit more, but again, the biggest takeaway is really that clinical work is not allowed unless that LMSW is properly supervised by a psychotherapist, an LCSW, and then that LMSW is working towards their LCSW licensure. That is the context in which you can perform clinical work. If you have your own practice, a private practice, you're allowed to engage in the limited activities allowed for an LMSW. You cannot hire someone to supervise you directly. You have to be in an environment that is already authorized by the Office of Professions. So that can be a private practice of an LCSW, that can be another clinical setting, which we're going to get into a bit more. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts, questions on those kind of major broad strokes at this time. All right, so with supervision, an LMSW, again, can only engage in clinical work. And the Office of Professions, again, has said an LMSW can perform general social work assessments, form and implement a plan of action based on a client's needs and strengths, and engage in counseling. And again, that work is not going to count towards LCSW experience hours. So the LMSW who goes into private practice on their own has to be mindful of the activities that they're engaging in and being aware that it has to stay within this proper scope. I'm talking about private practice, but there might be other settings where an LMSW is situated, and it is the same idea, right? Where you're not able to provide clinical work or engage in clinical activities unless you have the proper supervision within that agency. It is possible in some situations for an agency to hire someone from the outside in this like limited scope to supervise you. That would not be a direct agreement between you and that supervisor. That agency would be involved. And again, I think that's a really good example of a time where there's a lot of different situations and your individual experience might be very different from others. So absolutely recommend that you speak with an attorney or someone else who knows better how these regulations work. You might want to check in with the Office of Professions as well. Sometimes, you know, they're not really going to interpret the law for you, and they may keep it broad, but it certainly doesn't hurt to ask them to see how far they're willing to go on giving guidance. So we're going to come back and I think talk more about clinical work and how it's defined and what may or may not be included in that definition. But for the sake of it, it's important to consider what it means if you do engage in clinical work and you're not in the proper environment, you're not properly supervised. You know, there are consequences for performing those activities. In particular, the education law says that it's a felony for a person to practice a licensed profession without that licensure. So an LMSW who is engaging in clinical work is practicing a profession that they're not licensed to practice. So that could involve a felony. The Office of Professions has taken disciplinary action against individuals practicing without proper licensure, including suspensions, probation, and fines. It's considered to be unprofessional conduct to engage in activities that you're not properly licensed to perform. So practicing or offering to practice beyond the scope permitted by law, you know, incorporates the potential for there to be discipline from the Office of Professions, essentially. If an LMSW goes into private practice, their activities must stay within the parameters set by the law. They have to be mindful of their practice and the public language that they use. So maybe what's on your website, if you're advertising on Psychology Today, what you put in social media, you really need to be clear about your services, make sure that you're staying within the scope of your practice and alerting people to where you stand and where you are in this process of working towards your licensure. Whether you're, oh yes, Marcia.
I was just gonna, I'm sure you'll get back to it, but just before we move forward.
Yeah.
So in other words, I just want to make sure I have this right, and so other people hear it again too. If I'm an LMSW, I can't go on to Psychology Today or any of these advertising sites and advertise, you know, Marcia Levy, LMSW, psychotherapist, depression, anxiety, assessment. If I can't advertise myself as a clinical social worker or psychotherapist and look as if it's just LMSW from my own practice. Is that, do I have that basic right?
Yeah, if you're in your own private LMSW practice, you are not operating in someone else's entity who is properly licensed and properly, you know, licensed also to supervise you and engage in the clinical work, you absolutely should not be advertising in a way that's going to mislead people, confuse people about what the scope of your practice is and what services you're able to offer them. So absolutely encourage people to be conscious of the language that they're using outwardly, then also in agreements with people, being clear to show where the distinctions are and where the limits are on the services you're able to offer. Yeah. So yeah, I kind of alluded to this earlier too about this idea of what settings are acceptable. And again, the education law in 7701 says that licensed master social workers practice licensed clinical social work in facility settings or other supervised settings approved by the department. They've said that a professional service corporation, a registered limited liability partnership, or a PLLC authorized to provide those services, that's within the scope of the practice of a licensed clinical social worker. So an M can be operating or can be providing services in one of these professional organizations that is authorized to provide these services. Yeah, so again, in this kind of, Sandy, please.
Yeah, no, I just want to, it's more inclusive in the sense that it's also agencies from Department of Health, OMH, Office of Mental Health. You know, there's a broad spectrum of agencies that are authorized to provide clinical services. under this provision.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There would be hospitals, clinics, schools, places where the Office of Professions has explicitly said clinical social work is allowed to be performed.
And just as an elaboration, following up on what Sandy said and what I had asked before they answered, Dan, if I'm an LMSW, let's say appropriately hired by an LCSW practice in the right way and I'm supervised, can I, getting back to like the Psychology Today ad, am I allowed to run an ad that says Marsha Levy, LMSW psychotherapist, without alluding at all to that I'm not independent?
Right. So you should absolutely indicate where you work, and, people should be able to identify how you're even allowed to do this in the first place. So if you're an M and you're working towards your C, people should be able to go and find that organization and see that someone who is properly licensed and properly licensed to supervise you is there too. So it would be inappropriate to just put yourself out there as if you're able to provide this without indicating, this source and this proper location setting that is able to supervise you.
Right. And part of that is because the responsibility of the LCSW who's supervising, and for also the consumer to know that those sessions, sometimes the LCSW has to be present in the sessions. Sometimes they obviously are aware and are managing, the case and are aware of private information. So it's because of other reasons as well, that we'll discuss more when we elaborate on what the responsibility of the LCSW is under those circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's just people should be very clear in their outward advertising, in agreements between providers and clients, what the structure is, what your licensure is, how you're being supervised, who is supervising you. That should be clear to people on how this is working. No one should be in a situation where it's unclear to them. And I did just actually want to go back. I realized I skipped something that I wanted to mention too, in terms of what are the consequences of this happening. Another big one is really, your malpractice insurance and the malpractice and how the malpractice insurance is going to handle a complaint. If you call your malpractice insurance provider because someone's made a claim against you or a complaint, and they see that you're practicing outside the scope, or even if it can be in gray area too, they may really not step in. It may not apply. It's important to look at your own policy and also just keep this in mind that these, again, situations are really unique. And you really have to be aware and mindful of that. Yeah. I think we've kind of spoken about this too, of this idea of whether you can, be supervised outside your own organization. That wouldn't be appropriate. You can work in, let's say, a private practice of an LCSW or someone else who is properly licensed. This can be a tricky thing on, whether you should be an employee or an independent contractor. My impression of the rules and regulations, that really speaks to how New York is interpreting employment law, also the Department of Labor, how they're considering who qualifies for unemployment insurance, the workers' comp board with workers' comp claims. My interpretation is that someone who is performing these services, so an M, let's say in a LCSW's practice, is properly classified as an employee and not as an independent contractor. We could get into kind of the details of how that is, but there's sort of an idea of direction and control. And also, if you're really performing the main purpose of this practice, of this business, it's likely that you're going to be regarded as an employee and not as an independent contractor, whether or not you know, this employer, this practice has decided that you're an independent contractor. You can't, you know, make those decisions. The law really governs it, and that's up to the interpretation of those, either a court or those administrative agencies that I mentioned. So it's important people consider that. Before I go into supervision a bit, does anyone have any questions on these issues? I see one long one. Those ones are tricky for me to
Dan,
get
I
through.
can read that to you because it's
Okay.
actually a really good question.
Okay.
So the question is, the person has a private practice as a certified hypnotherapist. She also happens to also have an LMSW, and she is not working toward her C. She advertises as a hypnotherapist and offers services related to hypnosis. She says that she advertises that she cannot diagnose and does not offer psychotherapy, but she does list her LMSW on her business cards and social media. So she's asking, should I just remove that information? She does not want to appear to be working outside her scope, so she's even considering not renewing her license and just being an MSW.
So I'm going to speak in general terms. Again, this is a perfect example of, you know, it's not enough to just like in a Zoom chat kind of try and analyze, because there's probably a lot of things to consider, but I am going to just state kind of generally what this idea is of scope of practice. It is, you know, open to interpretation, but certainly a rigid interpretation would be that the Office of Professions is really governing what you're doing. If you have this licensure of LMSW, you are not supposed to be engaging in activities that are outside that scope. And you can't really just like turn off and on your license, right? And this is a tricky thing too, because I know people want to coach and do other things as well. So you can kind of see where this, I'm forgetting the term, Sam, remind me, the dual.
Oh, yeah.
What is it?
Sorry,
Dual.
I just blanked on it too. Like,
okay, it'll come to
dual
someone.
practice, like, yeah, like how we've talked about being like a yoga instructor and an LMSW or an LCSW.
Yeah.
Oh, dual relationships. That's
dual
what
relationship.
Dual relationships.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So thanks a lot. So yeah, that's something that people really need to be mindful of. You know, specifically the regulations prevent even Cs, right, from prescribing medication. So there could be situations, we don't really know how broadly that's interpreted. Seemingly like hypnosis doesn't necessarily hit that, but other services that people might be providing might be drawn into this kind of potentially wide category. So I don't know, you know, you should really speak to someone directly and more than in just like a few minute conversation about this, but you do have to consider, you know, what you're offering to people. And if it's potentially, even if you're laying it out, does that necessarily mean that the Office of Professions or some other regulatory body is going to say, oh, you were very clear that you're not offering this? You know, it could get murky, and it could come down to what your client is saying and their experience of the services that you're providing. So it can get really complex, Sandy.
Yeah, no, Dan, I think that's a very good question because it raises a lot of issues. You know, if you're providing any service, regardless of your license, you know, are you certified in that? Have you done the commensurate work to be able to do that? In this case, you know, I think it's also how the client perceives it, even though you're saying that you're not providing those services by nature of the fact that they know you're a social worker. That's where it gets murky. Very often, you know, the recommendation is if you're not providing social work services is don't put your license then on your card or, you know, any kind of advertisement like that. I would never tell someone to get rid of their license. You can always inactivate it in case you want to go back to it or, you know, do a change of career. You know, but, you know, again, as Dan said, you may want to discuss this further, but I think the safer course is to not even raise that you're a social worker if those are not the services you're providing.
I agree.
Dan, I want to jump in with one more scenario that came up in the chat that I think is really important. So one of the participants asked about LMSWs practicing as private practice through online platforms like BetterHelp and Alma. So I want to say what I know about this, and I want you all to like jump in. So,
Please.
an LMSW cannot own a private practice and provide clinical services. So if the work that's being done on BetterHelp and Alma is clinical, an LMSW in New York State can't do that to operate as a private practitioner because you have to be supervised. The other thing with platforms like BetterHelp and Alma is that a lot of times those are crossing state lines, and it is up to the social workers to understand the laws of the scope of practice in every state. So we have a lot of people who are like, I think Marcia, you can talk to this, you're duly licensed in multiple states because you can't practice outside your scope in another state. And every state has their own laws. And now I want to hand it over to you all to address this.
Yeah, Marcia.
Of course, yes, if you're I'm licensed in 3 states as a clinical social worker. I'm licensed in Florida as what they have this weird thing, which is I'm a licensed, registered mental health online therapist for Florida. They have this weird thing where I'm not licensed if I physically go there, but I'm licensed in New York to do Florida work for Florida. So every state, as was said, every state has its own regulations, and sometimes they're tinily different. So that's a whole complicated thing to keep up with if you are licensed in multiple states. But I know I've spoken to several people along the way who've been solicited by, I don't know necessarily Alma or Headway, which I sense are a little more correct than some of the others. It's not a plug for them, but BetterHelp, and there were some others that I thought were really loosey-goosey. And I know that some LMSWs said to me, well, the organization says they're going to give me clients in all these states, so it's got to be okay, right? And my answer was, no, it doesn't got to be okay. The licensee is the one left holding the bag. I think, Dan, you can speak to this. If you are operating in New York out of your scope of practice, the fact that BetterHelp or whoever gave you clients and set you up to do it isn't going to let you off the hook. Am I correct about that, Dan?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, people have to be mindful. I think some of those platforms are set up where you can be limited to the states that you're actually licensed in, but that's certainly something that people really need to be mindful of. If you're practicing in another state, either because the client is in the other state or because you're in the other state and the client is in New York, you have to be mindful of the rules of that state. And also how New York is interpreting that interaction. Generally, New York says if you are located in New York or the client is located in New York, you have to be licensed in New York and you have to be following the rules of that other state. And all the states, like Sam alluded to, have a wide variety of rules. I think generally you can assume that if either you or the client are physically located in the other state, you're supposed to be licensed there.
And I think it also speaks to your issue about the form of employment, which I know gets much trickier, and it's not the kind of thing social workers, I think about first thing. They think about who's going to supervise me, what kind of work, the business of what does a W-2 mean versus what does a 1099 mean, and again, stop me if I'm wrong, W-2 sort of standing for you're an employee. 1099 means technically you're not an employee, you are your own independent contractor, which means theoretically it's your own business. Is that if you're 1099?
That's right. Yeah, you're separate from the business. So, my big example that I like to use sort of like sets it in this, other sides of the spectrum. One, you're an employee, you're performing those main activities of why this business is practiced even exists in the first place. On the other side, as an independent contractor, you might be, someone, the practice might contract with you to do a specific thing, like build their website. And they just kind of task you with this thing, and you agree that you're going to get paid this certain amount. And then you go off on your own and you do it without their, direction and control, right? So you kind of come back and give them this finished project, and that's it. And it's usually more on like a limited term basis too. So that's kind of what people really have to consider there in this like W-2 employee versus 1099 independent contractor difference.
I think a good rule of thumb is if it's not allowed in New York State, then it doesn't matter what platform you're on. You're licensed in New York State, and that's what you have to follow. Many of these agencies in the fine print say, they have a disclaimer that it's up to you to really make sure that you're properly licensed or, properly receiving supervision. And again,
that's right.
It's so although it's confusing because they say, oh yes, they'll sign you on, just like Psychology Today will take your ad. They're not verifying that you're meeting the requirements of your scope of practice.
Right. And just for the sake of it too, to say the supervisor has a legal and professional responsibility for the clients that the supervisee is saying. So an independent contractor situation, it's sort of like offloading that responsibility, which you just can't do. So it should be interpreted as well under these regulations that it's really not possible. The supervisor, whatever they call the relationship, you're still being held to that standard. You're responsible for the clients of your supervisees.
So again, just to flesh it out, if I were an LCSW and I thought I was going to hire, let's just put it in quotes, an LMSW, and I said, come on, I'll supervise you, give you hours, but you have to be a 1099 contractor because I'm not going to pay your benefits. I'm not going to, pay into Social Security or whatever. You can, work in your wherever, but you'll work for me, but as an independent contractor, and you're an LMSW. That LCSW is probably not operating properly by giving a client to an LMSW who's a 1099 contractor. I know it's not clear cut, but would you say that LCSW is potentially running into trouble?
Yeah, I'd say there are issues there. It goes certainly even beyond just this like idea of supervision, like I alluded to too. There's a host of rules, regulations, and laws that govern this and these type of relationships. And certainly in New York, the courts are interpreting more relationships between a hiring party and the hired party as employer-employee versus, the independent contractor relationship. I understand that it feels often like it's easier to have someone on as an independent contractor. I would argue that the potential problems that could lead to are absolutely not worth the ease that it may seem in the short term. I have a guide on my website regarding the responsibilities for New York employers that I'm going to put in the chat. And, the idea of this fairly comprehensive guide is, once you get over the initial shock of all the things I list, hopefully it actually dispels some of the concerns that you might have of going in that direction and being an employer, and be able to see where things are maybe not as overbearing as it feels from the outside, and it just seems so much easier to enter this independent contractor relationship. Yeah, but you have to look at it quickly and then sleep on it and then go back in and catch your breath before you freak yourself out too much. Are there questions perhaps around supervision or other thoughts that people have?
So we have a question that I was just answering in the chat. So I'll finish the written answer, but I'll go ahead and answer it. So someone's asking how the LCSW can be held responsible by the Office of Professions. And I said for clients and LMSW is working with under supervision, and the LMSW suddenly leaves and abandons the clients, even though there's a signed contract that the LMSW gives 60 days notice. So what I was writing is that it doesn't matter what the situation is, the LCSW who's supervising an LMSW is always responsible legally and professionally for the LMSW's clients. So it doesn't matter if they just quit one day and don't give any notice, or if they're still there, or if something bad's happening in therapy, the LCSW is the one who's responsible for the clients.
Yeah, if the LCSW is in private practice as well, they should realize that client is their client. They have somebody on their staff who is providing the psychotherapy services, but that client is a client of the private practice. So you are not, offloading any sort of responsibility on the person who's providing it, whether they're an M, a C, that responsibility sticks with you.
There was also a question about insurance for an LMSW. Most insurance companies do not cover an LMSW for treatment because that's not in their scope of practice. So usually in a private practice, it's the LCSW who's billing. It's not the LMSW. And that again, you need to be very mindful of, and the LCSW, as Sam was saying, is responsible for the totality of the care. So the diagnosis, being very clear, that you're providing the backup, that you're providing the supervision, that this is who they can contact if there's an issue. So it's a very encompassing, role that the LCSW plays.
Yeah, I think the idea was that the LMSWs are licensed here as LMSWs with the intention that they're moving towards their C. I understand in some settings and different, people's plans for their own activities and career, that might not be necessary to pursue the C. But generally speaking, it seems that these structures have been really created for that general course of things. And you can see then how it plays out in a situation like malpractice insurance, where the idea is the C, the LCSW is this one who is covered because it's clinical work that the M is providing.
Okay, just a few more questions. Sorry, Dan.
No, you're good.
One asked if an LCSW can be hired as a contractor. The simple answer to that is yes, depending on who's hiring you. So if an LCSW has a private practice, they want to contract with another LCSW, they can, because an LCSW can practice clinical social work independently. A contractor has to be able to practice independently. And then how would the path to clinical hours standard that differs in each state be included in the licensure compact? Okay, so I wanted to take this question to explain that there is legislation for a licensure compact that is not in effect in any state at this point. It has to be adopted by 7 states before it can even go into effect. And right now, only 1 state has adopted it. New York State is not even considering it because it is our laws supersede the compact laws. So the laws, our actual laws around licensing, would have to change before we'd ever be able to even think about adopting the compact. So when the compact is in place, it will only be between the states that are a part of the compact, not other states.
I do just want to go back to this idea of employee, or whether an LCSW bringing on another LCSW, whether it's okay for them to be independent contractors. My interpretation is that that person should also be an employee if they are providing psychotherapy services. I would say if, they're doing something else outside of it, I know that's seemingly not the point of the question, but if they're consulting with someone, and they're running through like 2 LCSWs or talking about one of their cases, perhaps in general terms. They might have a consulting agreement between them, which is probably a smart thing to do for the person who is providing potentially advice, to be clear about what their role is and what their responsibility is towards that client and otherwise. But I would interpret bringing an LCSW into a practice to provide psychotherapy as an employer-employee relationship. And again, that the person who is the owner, let's say, of the practice, they are going to be responsible for all people, all clients of the practice, no matter what you call the arrangement. But yes, the person who is providing direct services to a given client, whether it's an LCSW or an LMSW, they are also professionally responsible, ethically responsible towards the client as well. So there's no real like offloading of those responsibilities. And I'm like very into Sam hitting the interstate compact. So I'm gonna let that one stand.
Yeah, Sam, there's a question about as a new graduate, maybe it would be helpful just to discuss from the beginning, now that you've graduated. Oh, I see you already did. Thank you. Really going into the number of hours and supervision. And again, just to give some history, and I've been in the field prior to us social workers being licensed, when we were only certified, and licensure happened really around 1985, around there. And originally, all social workers had to work in an agency for 3 years, before, and be supervised by an LCSW before they could obtain their clinical license. The New York State Education made a provision to allow LMSWs to work, under LCSWs in private practice. But again, that's, as Dan's been describing, there is a very strict protocol on how that happens. And it's not for an LMSW to be able to, graduate and think they're a trauma expert and they're going to be starting their practice, in August, when they just graduated in May. The idea was that they would, if they chose that route, that they would then, be hired by a practice, an LCSW practice, and then would be providing and seeing clients under the auspices of that LCSW. Again, the issue with the labor law is that, you don't want to have those dual relationships. If you're paying someone for supervision, or if you're working for someone and they're also supervising you, that creates tension there. That creates, other ethical, dilemmas, so, again, that's why some of these regulations are so clear, because it's really written to protect the consumer and to protect the clients that you're seeing, and to ensure that the highest level of care is being provided and under the correct, practice and supervision. I hope that's helpful.
That is very helpful. Thank you. I did catch a question that I like, which says, what kind of supportive counseling functions can an LMSW practice? And I am so into this being a discussion, but just for the sake of it, I'm going to read it from the education law itself. Again, that is Article 154, Section 77011, which you can find in the NASW's FAQ, which went around earlier in the session and I think might be going around again. But they lay out that it's the professional application of social work theory, principles, and the methods to prevent, assess, evaluate, formulate, and implement a plan of action based on client needs and strengths, and intervene to address mental, social, emotional, behavioral, developmental and addictive disorders, conditions, and disabilities. It goes on and on. It's a pretty broad definition. They say that a licensed master social workers can engage in administration of tests and measures of psychosocial functioning, social work advocacy, case management, counseling, consultation, research, and so on. So pretty broad strokes and definitely a lot of gray area, which is also one of the big concerns about an LMSW going into private practice. How do you define where these lines are drawn on things that come pretty close to clinical services, which are seemingly outlined in 77012, which covers LCSWs who can do assessment-based treatment plans, psychotherapy, and psychotherapeutic treatment, diagnosis, and psychotherapy. So broad strokes within the regulations. I don't know if people have thoughts about some of the specifics or, you know, where they see those lines or activities. Also, I'm sorry, just for the sake of it, section 77021, which lays out the activities that don't require any kind of licensure. Of course, people with either LMSW or LCSW licenses can perform those activities.
I think there's potentially very grave danger for especially new graduates or relatively inexperienced, 1 to 3 years out of social work school, engaging in a private setting with, it may sound like supportive counseling. The problem is, first of all, one doesn't know what one doesn't know. And I give the example, I specialize in grief and bereavement work, complicated grief. I do other things too. But let's say an LMSW starts out just, they know someone, they have a client who had a loss in the family, and they start out helping them find support groups. That's clearly within the scope of an LM. They're doing things for that person within the scope of counseling. But in the course of working with them, they start saying, I can't sleep at night, I'm having flashbacks. And you can so easily, mistakenly start talking to that person. That is clinical work. If you start talking about their flashbacks and what they might do for their flashbacks and what it might mean, you have crossed the line and you have engaged in clinical work improperly. And it's very hard once you start, especially if you're not in an agency where you're getting very close supervision and someone can say, wait a minute, you can't discuss that. But an LMSW, a new one in a private practice, starting out within their scope of practice, I think is really at high risk of crossing the line without knowing it.
Hi, I asked the question in the chat, and I just want to follow up with that statement that Education Law Article 154 7701 Part 1. It says, it says, and methods to prevent, assess, and evaluate. And then it leads into a language about intervention. And so would it really be beyond the scope of an LMSW if they're being told by their quote unquote client that they're having trouble and having flashbacks, when your obligation as a M is to also intervene, and what is written here to also prevent?
Right. I think there's a difference between intervening and providing concrete services. And I think this is where this gets, a little murky, and again, the difference between the clinical, the LCSW and the LMSW is that the clinical, you're providing a diagnosis, you're making the diagnosis. As an LMSW, you can't make that diagnosis independently. Now, I'm not saying that you didn't do an assessment and you have a good idea of what's going on, but you then go back to your supervisor and you develop a treatment plan, or your supervisor in many cases will then see the patient themselves, to make a determination. I think when the education law is referencing an intervention, they're talking about concrete services, providing case management, providing, resources, so if you're seeing your client, for a case management situation, and as Marcia said, they begin to describe this, then your role would be to provide a resource. If that's not what you're providing at your agency, it would be to provide a resource for that person or connect them to a licensed clinical social worker who would then be able to work. So that's what that means in terms of connecting that person or providing, a service. Supportive is usually you're not changing behavior, you're supporting the person in their decision. It's very different than doing an assessment and now doing psychotherapy, where you're looking to change someone's behavior and to change the way that they are able to function in the world. So I mean, there's more to it than that, but just if you can begin to see the difference, it's critical, and it will be looked at that way. Is that helpful?
Yes, it's helpful. I appreciate your sentiments, Ms. Sandy. I do have a follow-up question about this idea of supporting clients, supporting individuals. And I understand the bit about linking them to the actual treatment from a fully licensed, able to diagnose environment. I think but it brings me to wonder about the in-between sessions of support and helping individuals with perhaps some social-based behaviors and helping them to work through that. Would that then also be considered as clinical work if it's perhaps social-based, like as simple as I keep going back home to check the doorknob, and we all know that is like a clear sign of something bigger. But
Right.
it
Right,
can
but I think that's what Marcia was referring as the slippery slope. You think you're just helping the person, look away from closing the door, but it's part of a larger issue. And that's where just providing that intermediary step isn't enough. So that's what I'm saying. You can't split the person, I guess is what I'm saying. You can't say, oh, today we're working on just this, and I'm I'm the social worker, but on Thursdays at 3 o'clock, you see your therapist. It doesn't work that way. People don't respond to you that way. And the responsible thing to do is very clear to be what your role is, and what the needs of the client is, and where those needs can be best met. Now, again, if you're working in an agency and your supervisor is an LCSW, they may say, okay, this is a good case for you, to be able to begin providing clinical work, but they're going to be with you every step of the way. You're not going to be doing it independently.
I think that is a absolutely beautiful way to understand support.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to understand support. Somebody put in the chat, so in the case of the doorknob, you'd help the client to refer them to the therapist. I think that I definitely would if I'm a very well-seasoned M, that I'd be able to pick up and refer the client to where they need to be to get the help that they need. My very last question, sorry to take up time, but my very last question is just about billing as an M. How does that work?
You don't. It's very simple. You don't. What are you billing? You're not. That's not within your scope of practice. And that's where a lot of people are getting into trouble. Dan said, part of the reason that I think NASW started having these chats is because we're seeing an uptick on disciplinary consumers who are finding, information on their insurance bills, that someone gave them a diagnosis and never discussed it with them. And then once they discovered that that person's only an LMSW, then, and that person was, being paid privately, but submitting a super bill. So there's lots of ways that, there's difficulty, but, the bottom line is an LMSW really ought not to be in private practice if you're trying to do clinical work. Again, as Dan mentioned before, but I think it's a very slippery slope if you're going to be, like the person who asked about being a hypnotist, if you're going to use the term social, you're going to call yourself a social worker, then your client is going to expect social work services and you're not providing those, so that's where it gets difficult.
And I think and Dan, I think from a previous chat, and unfortunately, I think a lot of these things are confusing. Even if you're really trying to read everything and practice ethically, these are not straightforward, in my opinion. And schools of social work, personally, I don't think they do a strong enough job with new graduates trying to give them a sense of what they can do and not do. But I believe, Dan, you once said, but if this is wrong, correct me, please, that even if, let's say I'm an LMSW, even if I'm not calling myself a social worker and not putting LMSW on my business card, I might be held to the standards of what an LMSW is supposed to know. Could you go and explain that a little bit? I can't off the LMSW.
Yeah, with any licensure, I'm an attorney, I'm licensed as an attorney. I don't get to pick and choose when I'm operating as an attorney. I'm always an attorney. So even though there's tasks that, people who aren't licensed as an attorney can do, quite a bit of the work I do falls in that category. When I do that work, I'm held to the higher standard of my license. So that absolutely applies to you all. If you have the M, the C, you're held to the standard of that licensure. I want to just speak to one thing too, and I thought those questions that Grace had were perfect and exactly, the point of us having this chapter chat. But one thing too of this idea of when do you have to determine whether it's appropriate for you to keep someone on or give them a referral or be clear about the level of support that you're able to provide them. It's not like the day people get their LCSW licensure, they're ready to do absolutely everything that there is, right? So it's true for LCSWs too. They have to make assessments. They have to determine what's beyond the scope of their capacity, right? It would be inappropriate to take people on or to hold on to people when you are conscious that what their issues are beyond you. And there's a way of, working with them and helping them get referrals and still being thoughtful about the support you're providing to them while they are transitioning to this other higher level of care, that all people should be comfortable to admit, right? There's a ton of things that I can't do and shouldn't do, right? I don't have experience in it. I'm not going to take it all on just because I'm a lawyer and it's legal work.
Right, and there's a question on the chat about an LMSW who is asking if they've done training in EM in trauma and other things, if they can in trauma and EMDR. Just because you've done the training doesn't mean you could do it. Doesn't mean that you're now an expert in doing this or have the license. It's great, and that we all, learn about different modalities and begin to educate ourselves. But that doesn't mean that you can do it on your own, whether you're an LCSW or an LMSW. But primarily as an LMSW, no, just because you've taken the training doesn't mean that then now you can practice. You still have to get your hours. You have to be supervised by an LCSW. If that's work that you want to do, then working in an agency that provides that or in a private practice that does that with an LCSW that can provide you with those clinical hours. That's what's necessary. There was another question about is an LMSW a life coach? No. People are using the term life coach in order to get around licensing requirements. And you'll see that a lot on platforms like Psychology Today and other areas, because a life coach is not licensed at all in any state of which I am aware of. So people are saying, oh, I'm a life coach, so I can get, I can do whatever, I think a life coach does. But no, an LMSW is not a life coach. Again, the regulations are clear in terms of the number of hours. I know there was someone else who asked a question about they were fortunate enough to do their clinical hours in 2 years, but the requirements is still 3 years of supervision. And that becomes a problem when you're looking at other states who, many colleagues that I had who transferred from Massachusetts, where it's only 2 years of supervision for a clinical hour, still had to get their 3rd hour in New York and sit for the LCSW exam. So it's, as Sam mentioned before, each state is different, but if you're practicing in New York, it behooves you to know what the regulations in New York are.
Yeah. That was very helpful. I do think people should consider the impact of the proliferation of life coaching on your practice, on your professions, and on these licenses. If people are able to access this and there's this blurred line, it's really minimizing the value of going to someone who has the proper education and experience to provide the services, and the public can really be confused about why there is such a greater value, depending on the person's circumstances. Of course, maybe a life coach is what they need, but there is this blurred line. And I think a lot of people who are advertising as life coaches are really advertising to do LCSW work, and LMSW work as well.
Dan, I know we're totally wrapping up here, but I wanted to clarify one thing, because Grace had another comment in the chat that was really good. So she was asking about billing for the service and not through insurance. So I do want to clarify, there are a lot of LMSWs who work for OPWDD or a state agency or a nonprofit who are well within their scope of practice, not providing clinical services, and the agency can bill for their services under like Medicaid or a different insurance company. We're talking specifically about clinical services and insurance reimbursement. So I just wanted to like differentiate that.
Right. I'm sorry if I was misleading, but it's always the agency that's billing. It's not the social worker directly.
Correct.
And I think there was one question in the chat which might put some things together, Dan, about someone asked about hearing that some LCSWs are just signing off on hours and maybe not following regulations. What are the consequences for, I think you said felony, practicing out of scope of practice, but the question made it sound like outright fraud. What happens to someone who gets someone to sign off on something they didn't actually do, or either party?
Yeah, I mean, there could be potentially significant ramifications for those individuals involved. Their license could be suspended, if not revoked completely. I don't know that I could speak to the specifics of that situation, but generally these are, violations of the code of conduct and other regulations that if there was a disciplinary hearing, this is the type of discipline that could happen. So again, just for the sake of repeating it, having a license suspended or revoked, fines, list could go on depending on the circumstances and what the damages that were caused to the individual involved, to the client.
I'm very sorry. I know that we're out of time. I'm very, very sorry. I know that we're out of time, but I just want to be extremely clear that especially because I'm looking at the comments now, and Isaac Jacobs, thank you so much for responding. I can be paid for my supportive counseling service as an M. I just will need to bill my client, please guide, right? And I wouldn't be billing, I wouldn't be billing insurance.
That's right. You can, an LMSW can have a private practice, can operate independent of other agencies or practices, and provide the services that, you know, we've been discussing and bill for those services. The concern that, you know, really raises the point of having this chat too, is there's so much gray area, and a lot of this just isn't so defined. So you have to be thoughtful about these, you know, services, and as Sandy indicated too, how the client interprets it, the services that they're receiving from you. But yes,
Beautiful.
you can bill for your services that are within the scope of your practice.
Okay, thank you guys so much.
Yeah.
All right.
I just want to add to that, because Grace she comes to a lot of our stuff. We always love it when Grace comes. She asks very thoughtful questions. But I also want to clarify that for a lot of people, like, so if you're doing case management, there's a lot of organizations that offer case management and they bill Medicaid for that case management. So it can be pretty difficult to build a practice when a lot of the clientele is on Medicaid or on, you know, a service that it's provided through other avenues. I just like to warn people of that, you know. Hey, Amelia, it looks like we might be wrapping up.
It does look like we're wrapping up, I would say. So we still have people entering too. I just want to thank everyone for joining us. We will, as you know, we've recorded this presentation. We will put it on our YouTube for everyone to view as well. We have that FAQ on our website. Feel free to bookmark it and go back to it in the future if needed. Thank you everyone for your time, everyone in attendance. Like Sam said, really thoughtful questions. We hope that this was valuable for you. And thank you again, Dan, Sandy, and Marcia, for all the time that you took to put this together and the years of experience that it took you to be able to put it together in the first place. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I'm going to turn off the recording now.